Hello and welcome to Everyday Politics with Laura May Lindo. I am your host, Laura May, and I am here today on land held down, cared for, loved, and stewarded by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. I want to offer you this reflection as we go into our first episode for Season 2 of Everyday Politics. A lot of people will talk about residential schools, and sometimes I wonder if they understand that those schools were legislated. It wasn't just that there were a group of educators who decided to mistreat another group of Indigenous students, but instead there was a bill that went through every single step to become a law. That means it went through debate, it went through committees, people spoke about the issues, people raised concerns about the issues, and then it became law. Residential schools were legal entities where Indigenous folks were taken from their families and sent away from their families to, in the words of John A. Macdonald, teach the Indian out of the child. I'm raising that because currently in Ontario, Bill 33 is also navigating that exact same process. It's currently in second reading. It's a bill that people are watching because of some of the ministerial powers that are being incorporated into that bill. And if there's one thing that we can learn from the Indigenous history of residential schools is that we have to pay very close attention to what happens, the language that's being used inside of the bills, and the particular impact that it could have on some of the most marginalized populations. And so to begin that conversation, I've invited a group of university students right here in Waterloo Region to speak to me. And so coming up after the break, we will get to meet Avery, Tanraj, Matthew, George, and Mansoor. And we will have an amazing conversation about Bill 33. See you then. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. We are going to dive right in, but before I start asking the questions, I just want to make sure that everybody is watching has a good sense about Bill 33, okay? So Bill 33 is called an Act to amend various acts in relation to child, youth, and family services, education, and colleges and universities. And today we're actually going to stay focused on the educational pieces, and in particular on kindergarten to grade 12. So one of the things that's important to note is that Bill 33 is actually in second reading. I was doing some research. They haven't finished all of the debate time for second reading, which means it hasn't yet gone to committee, which is when like the community can start to plug in. So that makes this conversation particularly important, right? We have an opportunity now to figure out what they're trying to amend in the Education Act and what the purpose is behind those amendments. Do we agree? Do we not? And that's why I have all of you lovely people with me to sort of start chatting. My very, very first question is sort of high level, very simple. When you folks read Bill 33 and you were thinking in particular about kindergarten to grade 12, so everything governed under the Education Act, what stood out? Like what was it that stood out for you? Did you want to start?
Yeah, of course. So, like, the first thing that really stood out to me was the school resource officers, because I feel like it's something that we used to have in reverse, and just generally having them back, I feel like, is a very confusing decision. I understand, like, some optic decisions that could be made to bring them back, but ultimately I don't agree with it, and don't see how it can help students in the long run.
Okay, and they don't specifically say the school resource officer, or some people might know it as SRO, but they do have a lot of information about the relationship between police and the schools, like having space on the schools for the police to be able to come in, or having conversations about what that might look like, right? So I'm with you. We're going to come back to that for sure. Was there something in particular that stood out for you as well?
Yeah, I would probably also say the ministerial control over changing the school names. I think that was something that stood out to me very much, because now they want to control maybe the past history that we may want to then fix for then the new generation to feel as if we're moving together with one another. But it looks like they want to kind of hold on to that past. And this kind of ruling kind of makes me feel like that.
It's interesting too because some of the viewers might know that the minister, without this bill being enacted, right? So it's still in second reading, it is not law, right? The Minister of Education, Paul Calandra, has actually taken over some school boards already. One of them is the Toronto District School Board. And when they do a takeover of the board, they appoint somebody to now be responsible for all decisions. And I was reading, I'll actually make sure that I find the article and put it into our resource list. But I was reading that there was a school in Toronto, 3 different schools actually, 3 different school names that wanted to change. I know one was Sir John A. Macdonald. I think there was Sir Alexander Mackenzie. I can't remember. But they said no. Like they just said no. Do any of you have experience with school name changes, or like have you heard about those kinds of things? I'd love for us to have a bit of a conversation about why that even matters. Anybody? Yeah?
Yeah, the one right here, we have Sir John A. Macdonald here in Kitchener-Waterloo.
Yeah.
And that was something that people really were taken aback by even changing it, because they said this is the first prime minister, we shouldn't really change our history. But then when you look into what he was actually doing to peoples, such as First Nations and Indigenous peoples, how he was treating them, it makes sense to want to change it, because we want to then give a new face to Canadian peoples. And it just shows that they want to live in the past. And that's, for me, the most striking example of not being able to think forward.
Yeah. And that's interesting actually, because when you were pointing out with the SRO program, like that again was a thing in the past. We thought that we had spoken about that. Would you be able to speak a little bit more about sort of the way that you position that?
Well, I'm a student studying history, and I feel like a lot of people think they like history, but I feel like they just have an obsession with the past and like kind of idealized version of it. And they think that in the past things were done better and changing it is bad. But it generally tends to be the opposite. When we change something, there's a lot of reasons going behind it, especially with school names or bringing back SROs or police on school campuses. It just generally is kind of an obsession with the past, not really wanting to change or be better, wanting just to bring something back because they think it was better.
Again, I find it really fascinating because I've been thinking a lot about the work that young people in particular, like students, have been the ones who were pushing for name changes. Students were the ones that were writing examples of what happens and why they didn't necessarily feel safe in schools when uniformed police were walking around, especially in K-12, right? And I would argue especially in high school. At that age, when they're younger, it's different because you're introducing police officers as like that safety place that you call if there's a problem. When you're in high school, there's a different kind of relationship. And I've been speaking a lot with people in the last few days about what it means for student activism. And I know this is kind of like a random question, but I'm concerned about what that says to you folks. So you're young people, you're involved in things, your idea is to get more involved in whether it's politics or social policy or that kind of stuff, right? Understanding your history is important, but understanding that when you do the movements to make the change, that change sticks is also important. I'm very, very curious about what this said to you as people interested in like civic action, to have the actions that you were doing and the kind of fight that you saw young people putting forward for adults to listen to them sort of pulled back by this legislation. Did you have any particular feels about that when you were reading the legislation?
I mean, I can kind of speak to that, especially with like the SROs going in, because I went to a school where there was like a lot of impassioned youth ready to like make change, and we did it in any like little way we could. And I kind of feel that like these different acts that they're trying to take, it's a constant reminder that they don't want us to do it, but not in a way that feels like lighting a fire in you, or one that does kind of feel scary or almost like confusing, because you let's say like want to go against maybe the way your principal has put like up a poster or something, or you're kind of against it. There's a space in there where you know that you could get in trouble, but there's still kind of the safety realm that maybe there's still like teachers or not a whole state representative of like an officer being there to go against you. In comparison of like, I think about some of the things like I used to do in my high school, and I don't think I would have felt as empowered to do so, knowing that state repercussion is that close.
Yeah.
You wouldn't even want to try like dipping your toe in it because like the immediate repercussions are there. And I know like the public often has even come to protest in front of our school with like different sort of questionable choices around like minors, but they always get all the freedom because it's like public property. And then like if we were to introduce police into our schools or anything like that, I would find that students would now be confused as to what is being allowed around them if they can't act out given the state around them, and then they watch the public. It would be very confusing and delay any student action, I would almost argue.
It's interesting too because one of the things that all of you are pointing out without saying it out loud, at least for me, is that the language matters. Like the specificity of the language in Bill 33 actually matters. So there's a couple different places, but one of the vague pieces of language that's in there is public interest. That the minister can intervene in K-12 education as part of these amendments, as long as it's something that has an impact on public interest. And so I would love the three of you actually to jump in and let me know, when I say public interest, what do you think that means? Because if we can't define it, we don't know where the minister is going to come in. I don't understand what the boundaries are of public interest.
When I immediately hear public interest, I'm confused because if it's about public interest, why is the public not being addressed about this bill? How many of my friends I was discussing about that and they're finding out for the first time what's happening?
Yeah.
So clearly there's not that much public interest on whatever you're about to put into law because we have no clue about it. So when I hear public interest, I know that's just like the vague thing of like we're thinking for you.
Yeah.
For ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's the public. Their public, not actual public.
Yeah. So if I come back to you with the notion, the thing that stood out for you was the power to control school renaming, right? And if I put that against the language of public interest, what are your thoughts about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, for me, I feel like this is the provincial government doing its very best to not offend one or the other side of the political spectrum. So they're trying to be as neutral as possible by kind of saying that you have to send us the name so we can approve it. But in and of itself, that creates even a larger barrier than we already had before. So now they're moving the goalpost even further for us students who are thinking of renaming some of these schools to even various different names to acknowledge the history, to acknowledge our past, but in a way that's very constructive, that it's in a way that is allowing us to heal and move forward. So even the idea of public interest, that is such a vague term that has so many different terms underneath it. And this is where the ministers, they have to then come out and give more detail, right? These sorts of bills are just introduced, and many people are not introduced to it as well. Even in our own community members, many of our peoples, they don't actually read any of these things. So when they send off their children, that's all that they really are doing. They don't know all these different things of the trustees and members of boards, right? Like these things we need to educate our peoples, but I am going off a little on a tangent there.
But I hear you, because that's part of the challenge. When you put the vague language in, then the people don't necessarily know what's happening, and they don't know because they're not reading anything from there. And I think that I want to end before we go to a commercial break. I want to come back to you because the thing that stood out for you was the reintroduction or the potential reintroduction of the school resource officer program. So police back in the schools, and that's the language around that is required. So the school boards are required to build a relationship with the police to figure out what that interaction is going to look like, which is why a lot of people are worried about the reintroduction of the SRO program. So when I put your concerns around bringing back this program that people had said was not working for them, including police. Just as a shout out, a lot of police services were saying, we don't even know what the program is supposed to do because it had never been revamped after it was first initiated many, many years ago. So when I put that program beside this vague language of public interest, are there any concerns that you have? Is there anything that you want to sort of highlight with using that vague kind of language around the reintroduction of this program?
I feel like the vague language works to make people not want to think about it. Like if it was more specific, people would have more questions about it, but having overarching umbrella words and kind of vaguely things that make it seem like it's in the best public interest makes people less likely to question it. I feel like that's a big part of the wording here.
Yeah. Yeah. So listen, This is season 2 of Everyday Politics with Laura May Lendo. And if there's one thing that hasn't changed, it's that I bake you bread. So we are going to take a commercial break. My lovely guests, students right here in Waterloo Region, are going to partake in some bread, and we will be right back after these messages. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Okay, so we are actually going to stay focused on kindergarten to grade 12, but I want to read something to you folks so that you can give me some insights. The Elementary Teacher Federation of Ontario, or ETFO, has taken actually a very, very strong stand when it comes to Bill 33. And in one of their press releases, they state the following, and I am quoting. I'll make sure for those that are watching that we have this posted for you as well. The proposed changes would expand the minister's authority to initiate investigations and place boards under direct provincial supervision, taking power from democratically elected trustees and replacing community decision-making with directives from Queen's Park. At the same time, the legislation would force school boards to introduce or reintroduce school resource officer programs, so the SRO programs like we were discussing before, despite their well-documented harm, particularly to Black, Indigenous, and other racialized students. So what we know, I'm going to start at the bottom because I like to do things backwards. So we're going to start with the SRO program. And we know for a fact that similar programs have existed in school boards across the country, not just in the province. And we know for a fact that even in Waterloo Region, that it was young people that actually started to write what their experiences were with these programs. They were from many different spaces, many different walks of life, and they were saying that the programs weren't actually being helpful for them. I'm curious to know what you think might be the strategy that the government is using to try and bring back this sort of idea about safety in kindergarten to grade 12, and why they would be doing something like that at this particular time. Because I really, really truly think that if we can't figure out what they're strategically trying to do, we cannot actually create opposition that will work. So I'm opening it up to all of you. Who wants to jump in and give me a sense?
I can start because I have been thinking about this, and I remember when I first read it and I was first kind of pondering on it. It feels like it's reintroducing more of a surveillance state at this point to me, because like kindergarteners don't need a police officer in their building. For outside of the purpose of like showing that yes, like there's people that could help you if you're scared, but once you start going into that age of like grade 12, we kind of are visualizing a different relationship, and where it's one that watches them and tells them what they can and cannot do. I remember when I was in high school, right before COVID-19, not to age myself or anything, there was a very brief moment where a police officer was in school before we shut down, and I remember seeing them and knowing that they were just there to watch the students that the teachers deemed like dangerous or irresponsible. And it kind of like plays into this other idea of like knowing that there's always CCTV cameras watching you and your phone's always listening to you, and it's a constant reminder of the state basically infiltrating these spaces to demonize, like there's no more innocent until proven guilty. We're assuming that these students are guilty, and then we're hoping that they act upon what we want so we can shut them down before they become radical or anything and do what they and be student activists, where a lot of activism stems from, which is just kind of, it's disheartening, but it's also like it's blatant at what you're doing. You know exactly who this is going to target. It's been the same group's not going to not get targeted like before. Groups of color, marginalized students, and you're literally only there to make sure they fulfill your weird idea that they're going to be terrible people, so you can justify harming them.
Yeah, and I want to take that and move it into communities. So when we're talking about those kinds of experiences, young people were saying, this is what's happening to me when I'm in my school, right? Like, this is how I feel, this is the vibe that gets created. like, I don't know how there's actually well documented research about the need to ensure that your environment where you are learning is set up in particular ways, because that makes it more or less conducive to learning. It's why there's a whole fight. There's a whole organization that talks about Fix Our Schools, and I'll make sure that that's also connected on the resource page, because there's schools where, like, there's buckets in the middle of the hallways because of the leaking, and the schools are falling apart and all of this kind of stuff, right? So if a student says, I don't feel comfortable, then it's very difficult for them to be doing good learning in that environment. But there's also the fact that there's stuff happening in the broader community that I'm not sure this bill is taking very seriously. And so during the break, you had actually mentioned about one of the concerns was, like, the role the community members now play when all of this kind of stuff is happening. Would I be able to send it over to you
Yeah,
and talk a little
absolutely.
bit more about that?
I think that the community members are being left in the dark. I think that these sorts of decisions are just being made over top their heads, and they don't really understand how to actually, converse with their own children about this, right?
Yeah.
People need to understand that even if police were in the schools, what would that really change, right? That just creates more angst, and even in some cases, the ability to actually want to show the police, I'll do what I want, right? It may create even a counter response to what they're attempting to actually enact. So I think that what they really should have done is bring these police officers into the communities and actually speak with community elders and leaders and get their perspective on what they actually see as the issue. Because obviously what they're going to argue is that this crime statistics, we must actually be able to use this to justify this, and this is why we must implement this. But if you then go ahead and just jump over everybody and not have this open discourse, it feels more as if you're imposing something rather than actually allowing it to be implemented, with everyone's approval.
So one of the things that I think is really important is that when we're having these conversations, we stay laser focused on solutions too, right? So it's easy for us to sit and talk about the problems till forever. There's always going to be a gap. There's always going to be something we've forgotten, all of that kind of stuff. But what I appreciate about your response is that there was an opportunity then to do the program or build a relationship differently than what we have had happen before, right? So if police officers were going into community and speaking to elders to have a conversation about what this could look like, or what that does look like, or is there a relationship that could be built here, as opposed to having it from on high, directed and required, where it's hard for community to get into a school. Like, your parents can't just go to the school, right? If you want to volunteer, especially with early years, like kindergarten to grade 6, you have to do a police check, and you've got to do all these other things before you're able to even volunteer to go on a trip. But it seems like there's an open door policy to have folks come in without the community actually having an opportunity to say anything, right? So I want to bring up something else that you had said in the first segment, because part of the challenge when you're thinking about historically how these programs have run is that nobody is taking seriously the kinds of gaps or problems that happened in these programs. So out of curiosity, would you be willing to speak a little bit about what you believe some of the issues were with the SRO program in the past? So why putting it back just as it is potentially problematic, and coming back to, like, then how is there a way that you can imagine that this program or relationship or whatever, like, to meet the requirements of law, should this become law, is there a way for us to rethink the relationship between police, community, and schools?
Yeah, I feel like generally the biggest issue with previous SRO programs is that it over-policed marginalized students. It worked on kind of isolating them in a way from their peers. It made schools feel less safe for a lot of students.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's generally, like, a big part of why so many students were against it, why student movements were the reason it got disbanded as a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and generally I feel like also just bringing it back now is trying to rebuild forms of trust between the community and police officers without any actual reform of what's happening with the police officers in the schools. So I feel like the best part, as Mansoor said, would be to work with the community to listen to what their concerns are before bringing back systems like this. Actually working to reform aspects of the policing system rather than just putting this on as a band-aid to bring them back without saying anything. without doing anything.
So there's two other things that I'm going to put on the resource page with this episode. One is a report that had come out. It was the Waterloo Region Police Services, and they were looking at use of force. So another piece of legislation. So legislation doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So the police would have to also be privy to the changes in the Education Act, because now they're going to have to do more stuff at schools. They're going to have to adjust their resources accordingly. And they also have like a Police Services Act, which they're legislated by, and that's how the state decides what safety looks like and all of this kind of stuff, right? One of the pieces of legislation requires that police services report use of force cases. So that's when there's too much force used and questions about this kind of stuff, and they have this report. And I remember, I'm going to dig up this article and get it on the resource page. I remember a use of force report coming out that was demonstrating that newcomers, Black folks, and Indigenous community members in Waterloo Region were disproportionately represented among those that were sort of logged with this use of force report, right? The following year, the WRPS decided to change how they collect the data and then redid the report. So I raised that because there doesn't seem to be anything in Bill 33 that wouldn't allow, that talks about complaints or concerns or what happens if the program isn't working. There's nothing that's really saying what the program or the relationship should look like. It feels vaguer now than what the relationship was before. And there doesn't seem to be a way to stop somebody from changing the rules of the game when reporting out to community, which leaves sort of a bit of a mess and concerns that I have about how much information will the community have. So out of curiosity, and we can go back round again, do you share similar concerns about how the community would be informed about what it is that gets created? Are there any, is that a real concern, or is Laura May just making this up?
No, I really do think that the community has to be given a lot of information. I think that they're left in the dark for far too long. And even there was something I just pulled up about the SRO program back in 2016. There, in 2014, there was independent studies by Carleton University, and they were looking at over 655 grade 9 students. Only 1 in 4 of those were actually minorities. So even though they said that a lot of people were in favor of it, it was most likely not minority students who were in favor of this, right?
Yeah.
So it even shows that whether they're trying to say it's something that is going to be accepted by the greater majority, it's only because the majority is speaking and the minority is not getting their voices heard. And this is something else that I think even in my own community, I lived in Brybeck at one point, and it felt as if the police were just there to kind of watch us, right? Make sure we don't do anything. And even when we went to the schools, it was as if the teachers were looking at us differently. They were talking to us differently. It felt as if the whole environment was just off, right? So when I went to Africa, I felt different. I felt as if I was a part of a community. People were actually looking out for me, right? So when I came back here, it exactly what Avery said, a police state, like a surveillance state, like everything is there to watch over you. But as I said before, the community members don't know what is being implemented, and they don't have anyone to actually converse with them directly. Only when it's time to get their votes. That's the only time. Exactly. But until then, they'll be in the dark.
So there's two things that I want to just put into the conversation, and we're going to go to another break, but we're going to come back, and I think we should start with these two things. One is that there are other pieces of legislation that community members have fought for that is meant to temper other places where legislation has perhaps given so much power to folks that can become harmful. So for example, I'm thinking of things like the Anti-Racism Act. The Anti-Racism Act actually does require that data be collected, and my hope is that since they've got the pillars that the Anti-Racism Act looks at, they look at education, they look at the criminal justice system, amongst two other, I think people were fighting for health and also social services, which is also part of the amendments in Bill 33. But my hope is that there's ways that we as community members can push for the Anti-Racism Act to be read in conjunction with the Education Act and these particular changes for Bill 33. And I want us to sort of think about that as we're moving forward. But the other piece that I want you to think about before, like, we're going to go to the break, so we'll get to gather our thoughts, and we're going to come back to this question, is something called ministerial directives. How many of you folks know about ministerial directives? Like, hands up if you know what we're talking about. So this, my friends, is something else. I'm going to try and see if I can find like a definition of it. But inside Bill 33, it says that, and part of what ETFO is taking up is that instead of having school board trustees be like this go-between with community to talk about the needs of community, decisions would be made by ministerial directives. That means that the minister directs the sector to do what they want. And the ministerial directives are done outside of even the legislative assembly, not out of the legislative assembly, but outside of the chamber. So in the chamber at Queen's Park, where this bill will be debated, is solely the legislation. The ministerial directives is something else. So we're going to go to a break, and I want us to think about what that means. As soon as we come back, we'll start there, and then I will give you your very last question to share. So we'll be right back after this. Welcome back, everybody. And so when we went to that commercial break, I was talking a little bit about ministerial directives. So this idea that the minister can direct the sector to do what it wants it to do, right? I want to ask you one other question, and ETFO raised this as well. There has actually been a lot of talk as of late. There was an interview, and the minister said that, in his humble opinion, we don't really need school boards and school board trustees, and that people should be looking out for a piece of legislation that will come by the end of the year to get rid of the school board trustees. And I've been thinking a lot about that desire beside the notion of ministerial directives that is embedded into the legislation. So as ETFO has explained, and if you read the legislation you saw, the minister can use these directives to say to the sector, this is what I want you to do. I'm very curious about two things, so feel free to go in whichever direction you want. First off, what role do you believe trustees and school boards play in our democratic system, and when we think about public education within that democratic system? And the second piece of that is, given that understanding, do you think that we can maintain the work that they're meant to do, or the purpose and the goals that you think that area is meant to do in our democracy, if instead of that we replace the trustees and the boards with ministerial directives? Is it possible for us to still have like a rich democracy and approach our public education system in the same ways? Who wants to jump in? I know it's a big question, but who wants to go?
Yeah, I think that it is funny that they're trying to bring democracy, but they've already created an undemocratic process by removing the trustees without our consent and our conversation. I think the trustees obviously play an important role. They are the link between the community and the school. I think that there are some things that I have a personal grievance against some trustees and some boards, but I think for the most part they do represent the needs of the community in a manner that actually does suit the community. And so now just removing it totally, bringing in the ministry, it just adds another whole step of unattainability, right? That's really the whole problem now. Like, how do I reach you? How do I get my concerns across? And this does not feel democratic whatsoever.
Got it. Who else wants to jump in?
I mean, yeah, like kind of just to build off of yours and the conception of community. I know like school boards are like one of the only places where like state or like, you know, government and community are almost like perfectly meshed, because I always know that so many parents go to these school board meetings and they know who their trustees are. and they have that kind of access, and they exist within the communities. They even like shop in the communities because they're representatives from the same area. So there's almost like this unspoken bond and understanding of like what this area needs, how to speak to them, what's important to them. And to get rid of them is to quite literally continuously like separate the people who are being governed, because like you said, like you have no access to these ministry directors or whatever, because where are they? I know that my school board trustees will be at this meeting at this time, and and if it's in my schedule, I'll go, I'll say my grievances, maybe it'll get heard. I have no clue where the ministry is. I have no clue where they're meeting. And I think it's also kind of scary, especially when like if you think of like newcomers or even people who just move to a new area, they have that as an opportunity to understand the more inner workings or the kind of the expectations of where they're going to go, or just to see where they could fit better into a community. And again, if you're removing such a central part of like people's lives, because the parents go there for the concern of their children, the activities there are, what's being promoted, because a lot of schools are also like community spaces and hold other events. Everything's all encompassing for these schools represent communities. So to rid that access to like government policy, what's being said, even though I don't agree with some like ways, like you said, the ways certain trustees may take things or what they're doing for their parents, there's still like that face-to-face confrontation, or at least like agreements or working together. And with this ministry, what they're doing is like showing us that they have full control over us, despite being constantly told that we live in this democracy that they promote so heavily.
Beautiful. And I want to throw it over to you as well. So what's your understanding about the role of the school board and the trustees? And what do you think might happen if we just sort of replace them with these ministerial directives?
I feel like the role of the school board is to kind of localize what's happening in the schools of their district to the people that live there. And I feel like by having it just be ministerial directives, it removes that level of personalization, it removes that level of connection that a community may have with their schools, with the teachers that work there, with the curriculums that are being provided. And by having that lack of access, that lack of communication can be at the detriment to students' educational experiences.
So I'm going to make sure for those that are watching that I have a link to information about the role of our trustees, because what I also find fascinating is that sometimes we take things for granted, like just as humans. And because the trustees are so close to us in our day-to-day, in the way that you folks have explained, like what you believe their role to be, they actually have a pretty low voter turnout. So when we're actually voting for the trustees, if they look at compare that to like your provincial elections and your federal elections, the voter turnout is rather low. And some people have said that part of it is because there's so many. Like you vote for a lot more municipally, and with it, so when you would see their names compared to when you're trying to vote federally or provincially, right? But I worry sometimes that the low voter turnout will become the rationale for saying, well, we don't need this because the community doesn't want it. So I'm going to ask the same question, but I'm going to shift it just a little bit. And I think it's good that we don't necessarily agree with everything that our trustees are doing, because they're supposed to represent like all the different people in our community, right? So if we think again of the role of the trustee, one of the things we've said is that they're the bridge between the elected side, like the election side is the side that may decide curriculum and might decide like how that's impacting us. They can't actually affect change in that curriculum, but they could at least raise concerns with the minister because they would have those kinds of meetings, right? They're the ones that would help us with our concerns of keeping community in the dark. They would be the ones that you could go to. They're easier to access. What other job do you think the trustees are doing that the government would now have to do? Because maybe that's part of it. Like the minister wants to give us directives, maybe we need to give the minister some directives. This is like the citizens' directives. I need some like soundtracks that go dun 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 dun, right? What other kind of job does the trustee or the school board do that you think, okay, well then the minister is going to have to do that job too? What could we ask of them?
I mean, the massive one is approving the school's budget.
Approving the school.
So this is where things get a little bit more dicey. You get rid of the trustees, now you have full access to the full budget, right?
Yeah.
And how much actually goes into it. all this is a money game for me.
Yeah.
I think getting rid of the trustees gets more money into the pockets of anyone who's working for the ministry. They won't obviously come out and say that, and I'm not accusing them that this is all creation in my mind. But in my opinion, I think that, I think the budget is very important. And then they also bring up the idea of creating student success and student achievement, all these filler words to get everybody on board. But when they actually do get into that position, we might see the exact same negligence that we've seen in some other trustees school boards across the nation. So at the end of the day, I think we always talk about checks and balances, but it just looks like they're looking for the checks, no balance.
No balance.
That's it.
I also think the other more abstract job they have to do is they have to show up to the community events. I had a trustee at my graduation.
Yeah.
Ministry director, how many graduations do you think you can go to in a day?
Yeah.
You have to be like, there's face to what you do, and they have more of an opportunity to do it. So you have to come, face, and then also be there to sit through all the parents raising grievances about a certain book they don't like in the library. Because that's what the trustees sit through. They sit through the parents going, I don't want this book, and it could be The Wizard of Oz.
Yep.
And they don't want it there, and the trustees have to hear it because they have the time, they have the space. Ministry, you're gonna have to do that for every single school board, for every single parent, after hitting up all the graduations and maybe a recital.
Yeah.
The kids want to see someone professional listen to them sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Very true.
You have to do all of that community work as well.
Yeah.
I feel like that's generally like the pattern with a lot of invisible labor done by so many people in positions like a school board trustee. When the ministry is looking at it, they don't see all the different hats that people on the ground are wearing, even like just generally liaising with the schools, like Avery mentioned, going to events, being at the place where the students, where the teachers, where the parents are, is such an important part of the job that just simply cannot be done at the ministerial level.
It's so funny too, because even with a minister's office, they're also an elected representative. So like technically they're doing community work. Technically they're showing up at an event. Technically that's part of what you have to do if you want to keep your seat. But there's a different level of showing up that happens when you are a school board trustee, and a certain relationship that you end up having with these kids. Like, you want to see them graduate. You want to be there, right? So I don't know technically how they'll be able to do that. But I am going to make sure that I put information about ministerial directives. We've had other kinds of issues with this, and what I'm going to also do is when we switch our focus for next episode and we're talking about post-secondary, I want us to come back to this and start thinking about what that actually means, because that's actually a space where we've seen ministerial directives begin to be causing some issues. But my friends, we've now come to my favorite part of the episode. I make everybody answer this. I think it's like important for us to speak into the universe what it is that we want, not just what we don't want. And I feel like change happens when we speak into the universe what it is that we want. So I'm going to go to each of you in turn. I'm going to start with you this time because I always start over this way.
Yeah.
So get ready. If I snapped my fingers and you could have any kind of system change, what would that change be?
I would want it to be so that the people legislating actually have to listen to the people that they are legislating over. Like, for example, making so the Ministry of Education has to listen to teachers and parents and et cetera, whoever else is involved.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm coming to you.
Yeah, I would probably say financial literacy is something that I think is very important, especially for immigrant populations.
Yeah.
I think that's something that if we're implemented, because of the amount of welfare and social assistance that's being dished out, many people don't have that financial literacy capability to understand how to actually use their assets and how to keep their money. So I think that will be one for me.
And it's interesting because that also connects back to one of the concerns that we have with the ministerial directives, right? If you don't have financial literacy, especially in this space, then you won't necessarily understand what it means for the government to be in control of the school budgets without any kind of intervening factor. Like, nobody, who do you talk to, right? So that, I understand that. I'm snapping my fingers. One system change. What would it be?
Well, on like the idea of understanding bills and other work like that needs to also be translated into like layman's terms or simpler language for the general public to understand, because the public's smart. they just don't have the time to pick apart your vague, lengthy puzzles of labyrinths of explanations, so you can slip in something that they don't quite know, and the public must be able to say confidently that they understand what this bill is before it gets brought to discussion. Because if the public doesn't know what it is, that's not fair. You're not making a bill for the public. The public doesn't know what you're doing.
And that's really interesting too, because as we said during the interview and our conversation here, there's certain words that are popping up that people don't know. We skip over them because we just sort of assume, how important could that be? But ministerial directive is something that we need to understand, or else we don't know where the control and the power is happening in that system. And vague language like public interest, what does that mean to anybody, right? And so I just want to say thank you. I just want to take a second to say thank you to all of you. It has been an amazing conversation, and part of why I was excited to have the first episode of season 2 be with young people in the post-secondary sector is because the reality is that you folks are you're studying to become the people in charge of all of us. And so I wanted to hear from you and make sure that we were having these conversations from now as we prepare to, pass the baton. And hopefully we'll be passing that baton sooner than later so that we can navigate some of the stuff that we are doing right here. So for everybody that's watching, I hope that you have enjoyed. We are going to take one more break, and then I will be right back with you. Hello and welcome back. Wasn't that a brilliant conversation? I have to say, I am so very proud and excited about what post-secondary students today are going to be able to do for us in the future. Because right now, they have such a good eye on what's happening when it comes to the legislation that's passing down the pipes. Their analysis is fantastic when it comes to raising concerns or issues that they think community needs to be paying attention to. And it's for that reason that I promise I will make sure that on this episode in the resource section, I will have some information about the Anti-Racism Act. I'll be sure to post the Ontario Human Rights Commission's submissions for the K-12 sector, in which case they, for Bill 33, they were focused on the potential of the return of the SRO program. So we'll make sure that we have some information about that. And I will also have ETFO statements so that you can see what ETFO has been saying about Bill 33. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please remember to follow me on Insta at everydaypolitics_official. See you next time.